Well, thank you all for joining us for the virtual tree walk of Hessel Park. My name is Ryan Pankau. I'm a horticulture educator with Illinois Extension, and I have a background as a forester and arborist. I've been fortunate enough to kind of spend a career in looking at trees and identifying them, and that's kind of how I got my start in my interest in forestry. So joining me today is one of our East Central Illinois Master Naturalists, Elizabeth Jeffery. Elizabeth, would you mind introducing yourself to folks?
Hello, yes, I'm Elizabeth Jeffery, and as you can probably tell from my accent, I was born in England, spent the first 25 years or so there, and was delighted when I came here to find that east of the Mississippi, the trees are actually not that different from Britain. And so I saw lots of familiar trees, and that made me very comfortable.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and start with some of the basics of tree ID. I'm going to stop my video so you guys can see the slide. Well, actually, we have a little bit of an outline. So this is what we'll cover today, which is kind of the basics of tree identification at the start. So we'll go through the way that you can differentiate amongst many of our native trees and other trees with just some of the basics. We'll give a little bit of information about Hessel Park because although we're not there today, we are virtually touring that park. And then we're going to go into all the specifics of the individual species on our tree tour. So we're going to kind of focus on oaks and maples today. That's what we're going to try and help you folks differentiate between. And so we'll give you some tips to differentiate between the oaks and maples themselves and within all of the trees as we go through this. So I think, Elizabeth, you were going to start us with tools, and now I think I will stop my video for a moment so folks can see all the slides and get the full view.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, we still have the outline up at the moment. I'm waiting for the next slide to come up.
Oh, okay. I'm showing the tools.
Here we go. We'll get going. Okay, I was going to tell you a little about the tools that you've got for identification of trees. You know, the most important one is vision, observation. You can look at all the different tree parts, including the full shape of the tree, which for some trees is very, very indicative. There are a few things that you can smell as a little different. I suppose it's possible also to taste a few things, but I wouldn't suggest that just in case you ended up tasting poison ivy or something terrible like that. Of course, the other thing that you need that's so important is a tree book that has a nice key in the front of it so that you can work through the key and find out what your tree is. This is one of my favorites. It's the Forest Trees of Illinois. And it might not have all of the trees from the East Coast, but it's got very many trees are similar here and anywhere east of the Mississippi. So there are a number of clues that we can use as we try to ID the tree. Leaves, obviously, in the summer are a big one, but this today is pretty much a naked tree walk. We will see some of the buds, and we'll also see the twigs. Won't see much in the way of fruit, but we'll see some flowers which lead to fruit, and bark. And I've put location in brackets because this is a park, and therefore people have planted these trees. Whereas if you were out in the wilds and trying to tell the difference, for example, between the northern red oak and the pin oak, you might notice that the northern red oak usually grows on a north or east facing slope, whereas the pin oak likes the bottomland. He likes his toes wet. And so that would be a great big clue. But let's move on and look at what you all expect to be able to find, and that's leaf types. You know, even in the winter, you can look down around the tree. You have to be a little tricky because a leaf may have blown in from somewhere else. But the leaf types come as simple palmately compound, pinnately compound, and bipinnately compound. Here we have simple, and the simple, this large picture here shows the shingle oak, and you can actually see the little bristle at the end of the shingle oak, and we'll talk about that later when we're discussing it in detail. But you also notice that the trees on the right, which are the sugar maple and the pin oak, are also termed simple, although they've got very jagged edges to them. They just have one stem joined to the twig, and that's what makes them a simple leaf. Palmately compound looks just as though you've got your hand up and all your fingers sticking out as wide as they will go. And this one is actually Aesculus flava, or yellow buckeye. And I started a yellow buckeye from seed, and it's now about 20 feet tall, and it has what I call conkers, the fruit, in the fall. And I just love the tree. It goes a beautiful color in the fall. Palmately compound.
And so I'll cover pinnately compound leaf types. And so here, what you guys are looking at is an ash leaf. And believe it or not, that whole structure that you see right there is one leaf. And I know we commonly would think of each one of those little, oval shaped green things as a leaf, but as the slide shows here, those are actually leaflets. So the whole thing together collectively is a leaf. And how can we tell where we have that division between a leaflet or a leaf? A leaf would have a bud at its base. So in this case, each one of those leaflets, if you looked at the base of where it attaches to the petiole, or where the petiole attaches to the rachis, you would find a bud right there if that was a leaf. But in this case, there's not a bud. So if we look at a little more complex of a compound leaf structure, we get to this bipinnately compound leaf. And believe it or not, that right there is considered one leaf in botanical terms. This is from one of our native trees, the Kentucky coffee tree, and it is bipinnately arranged along the stem there, where we have all these different sets of leaflets in this compound structure. So that's one of the biggest leaves in our state, and there's not a whole lot of other trees that have this characteristic. But Elizabeth, you have a favorite that does. Would you mind kind of mentioning that?
Yeah, sure. The locust, the honey locust, has also bipinnately compound leaves. But the strange thing is that it starts out that way, and then as it gets aged, maybe it doesn't have the same amount of energy or something. I don't know the reason, but most of its leaves in the older one are only pinnately compound. So unlike this wonderful thing that is 3 feet long, believe it or not, the honey locust is only, what should I say? It's a foot or less typically. And one of the reasons that people love it is because the leaves are small, the sunlight comes through, and you can actually grow grass underneath that tree. Okay, now we're going to talk about the leaf or twig arrangement. And this is our first big tool for being able to divide trees into 2 groups. Those trees that have their leaf arrangement opposite, and those that have it alternate. There's also whorled, but that's very, very limited. The nice thing about opposite is that it's relatively limited. So if you find the opposite arrangement, then you know it's just one of a very small group, and you're all far away going to identify what the tree is. Oh, I thought you were going to take this one out. I think this is too much like botany. Let's just pass on. Okay, here's the opposite arrangement. And you can see it very, very clearly. The one on the side is the sugar maple. And we'll come back and talk about that more, but you can see the very, very pointy buds on the sugar maple. And that's really indicative of which kind of maple it is. But you see how clearly these twigs come off from opposite one another. Of course, what happens sometimes is that one breaks off, and then it doesn't always look every time like opposite. So you have to look at several instances to be sure. And here's the arrangement called alternate, which is most trees. And you can see this actually is a red bud, and you can see the little buds that are in the axil of the petioles, or the leaf stem. And you can also see that this twig tends to bend towards each place that there's a leaf. That doesn't always happen. If you look on the left, the upper picture is the red oak, and the lower one is the white oak. And those are pretty straight. They don't woggle back and forth the way that the redbud does. Okay, and this is whorled. Ryan, I think someone is in the waiting room. And whorled is actually very, very uncommon. And so you'll notice that it's present on catalpa. And here in Illinois, we have a lot of catalpa, and they're very easily recognized not only by this, but by their long beans. And so you're thinking, well, how am I going to help myself with this business of alternate and opposite? Actually, there's a mnemonic, and mnemonics can be very, very useful. So I told you there are not very many trees that have the opposite arrangement, and they are maple, ash, dogwood, and the Buckeye family. And so you could think of that as mad buck. Or if you want to include the horse chestnut, which of course is part of the Buckeye family, then it's mad bucking horse. So you better not get on it. On the right, you actually see my yellow Buckeye. I brought the bud inside, and you can see two sets of leaves that are starting to appear either side of the terminal bud to give you the opposite effect.
So if we were actually out on a real tree tour today, I think what I usually ask folks as we get up to each tree is to look and see if you can tell if it's opposite or alternate. And so this is kind of the view. It's not a great picture of these twigs. It's not close up. It's probably what you might see from the ground on one of the lower branches. And so this is actually of an oak tree. So these little the tips of these branches are of an oak tree. And if we look, we should find an alternating branching pattern. And if we look close enough with buds, we especially could see that on a twig. But if you see the tips here, like I have circled, often look opposite of each other. And that's just because there's a lot of growth kind of condensed in those tips. And so it can be tricky. So as Elizabeth kind of alluded to earlier, you need to probably look for multiple points in the canopy to confirm whether it's opposite or alternate. So I always try to, as I'm standing on the ground in the wintertime, there's no leaves for me to start with. I'm starting with that branching pattern, and I'm looking for first, whether it's opposite or alternate. I'm trying to find that in 2 or 3 spots in the canopy. I want a good data point to say, oh, there's something that really looks opposite or really looks alternate. And you know, I took this picture purposefully trying to trick you guys with some opposite looking branches on an alternate tree. When you have the whole canopy to look at, you can kind of spread out your field of vision and where you look, and you can probably see better examples around the canopy as you start to look in different areas. So here's another example of that same kind of view you get from the ground. And in this case, this is actually an opposite branching tree. This is silver maple. And so right there is a really great example of that opposite branching. And that's again in the tips. So that could be a little tricky. This could be an oak that's, you know, maybe trying to fool us. And if you look back in the rest of that just big bramble of twigs or mess of twigs back there, it's really hard to kind of pick out the opposite or alternate stuff in this view. So the point is you need to move around the base of the tree. You need to look at different points in the canopy, and you first need to, again, try and figure out that branching pattern as the first step of ID. And like Elizabeth mentioned, if it's opposite, you're great. You know, you've got it narrowed down to just a handful of species. If it's alternate, it's kind of back to the drawing board. So that's what we'll try and look at in some of these slides coming up, is some other ways to differentiate. So with that, why don't we go ahead and hit the park? So just a little bit about Hessel Park. It's located pretty centrally in Champaign-Urbana, so it's a very visited park. Has been in, you know, with the Champaign Park District for many years, since 1918, and, you know, is almost 30 acres. So pretty good sized place. You can see kind of the aerial view there on the right. And there's just a wonderful list of amenities there in what the park has to offer, and plenty more information online if you go to their website. But one of the reasons why this place is just wonderful for guided tree walks and tree ID hikes is first that it has this accessible trail. So multiple access points around the park, and this paved trail circles the entire park. In the past, the Park District, in conjunction with some other partners, has developed this wonderful little tree walk guide. So that's available for free online as a PDF. It has a nice little map of all the trees in the park listed there, and some details. You can see on the right, each tree has its own little page with this wonderful illustration that was done by Gene Burridge, one of the Park District employees, a certified arborist that probably knows these trees better than anybody in Champaign-Urbana. And so Gene did those wonderful illustrations. It works great for the trees in Hessel Park, but also great for any other places a silver maple might grow. There's some just wonderful information in there. So as Elizabeth and I tried to adapt this for a virtual tour, here's the map that's kind of in the, you know, in that guide the Park District has put out. And so if we were really there, we probably would start a little pavilion. That's typically where we kind of start our tours. So we all would have met there. We're going to kind of use this map today to move us around the park virtually and show you where we are at. But before we get into moving around the map too much, I do want to introduce you guys to our guide for the day. This is my son, Rowan Pankau, and he is a 3-time junior ranger with the National Park Service. That's a program you can participate in. I encourage you all to get interested in that if you're at a national park with your kids. But this was a great activity for Rowan and I as kind of a homeschooling activity to go out together, look at some trees in the park. And he was super excited that day. You can see this was a beautiful sunny day just here recently. And one thing that really excited Rowan on this tour was the little tree tags. So you can see here, this is a pin oak tree, and each tree on this tour in the Champaign Park District Guide has one of those little tags up. It tells us the scientific name, it tells us the common name, and Rowan just loved running ahead, trying to look at the map, find the next tree, and I could hardly keep up with him trying to find these tags. So that's a great feature of this park tour. But if you live in another community, chances are there's probably a park somewhere close to you that has a similar tour set up, that has some labeled trees, that that labeling really makes it fun for the kids. But you as a parent can also guide children or other groups if you found one of these guides that was developed for a park around you, and there probably is one. So I'd encourage you all, even if you can't ever visit Hessel Park, there's probably something similar in your community, and I encourage you to seek that out. So let's keep going here. So this is actually a view of the pavilion we just looked at in the 2D map in a little bit of 3D. And so this is brought to us by Google Earth. So we're going to use Google Earth in this kind of virtual 3D view to help you guys kind of visualize moving around the park as we talk about some tree IDs. So the next slide here kind of shows us our first tree. So not far from the pavilion, we're going to start with number 27 on the list. And here's kind of a flipped around view where we're looking from the north now, where we're looking from the south before. And that circle there shows the tree we'll be looking at really well, and that is a pin oak. And Elizabeth, I think you were going to start with a little discussion of pin oak.
Absolutely. These are magnificent pin oak trees. You can see that they're very, very tall. The park was donated in 1918, and so they could have been planted then, or they could even have been planted earlier as part of the driveway up to the gentleman's house, who, of course, was called Mr. Hessel. Whatever, the pin oak is quite a rapid growing tree. It can grow as much as 3 foot a year, up until it gets to about 70 foot or so. And I think that the largest pin oak is said to be in Tennessee, 110 feet. But I just wonder if one of these is actually larger. The trees in the park have been, oh, could you go back a second?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure. I got ahead of you.
I wanted to point out to you that you can see very clearly the trunk of these trees, whereas typically the pin oak actually has tree branches that hang down, and then a little further up, out, and then a little further up, up. Now you can go on. So you can see the shape on the left in that tree, the way that the branches at the bottom hang down. That is very typically pin oak. And also you can see that some of the leaves have dried and stayed on the tree during the winter. And that's called Marcescens, or a Marcescent tree. And it's thought that maybe it protects the buds from being chewed by deer, because they don't like this bristly feeling that they get from the dead leaves. But I don't know for sure about that. In the middle, you see the leaves. You can see that they have a lot of bristles. And we'll see in the future that bristles are on the group of oak trees we call red oak. The other thing about the pin oak is that it has a sort of marking that some people call like a ski trail that goes up and down the bark. And I think you can see that quite clearly here. And then it has these funny squat acorns. If you're used to looking at a white acorn, that sort of white oak acorn is sort of oval, and these are all squat. It's like the edges of the acorn come out straight from the little cap.
And so those acorns are pretty definitive in identifying pin oak. So the day that Rowan and I were there, we looked around pretty hard on the ground there. And you can see in his hand, we did find some old caps that were kind of shriveled up from sitting out there all winter. In parks, they do such a good job of trimming and mowing around trees that it's sometimes hard to find this evidence. In the woods, you'd be able to find a amount of evidence underneath this tree. So that's another tool for interpreting this, but you always have to wonder, is this cap that Rowan's holding, did it come from this tree right above us, or did it blow from another one, or did it get there? So how did it get there? So it's another data point, but again, I want to try to confirm with some other things, but that's one of the things as a forester out in the field in the wintertime trying to do tree ID. I'm always scratching around in the leaves and things and trying to find some other clues if I'm unsure. So that's another clue you can always try and find year round, is some type of either fruit or nut or leaf on the ground.
But it's a little tricky when you're in a park, because they may have mowed the ground and blown the leaves somewhere they don't belong.
Yeah, definitely. A little less predictable, but this brings us to a slide where we kind of talk about the difference between the red oaks and the white oaks. And if that isn't super confusing when you start talking about the species white oak and then the family of white oaks, which contains the species white oak, we get mixed up on our terminology sometimes. But Basically, oaks are divided into what we would call two different families, or also subgenuses is another way folks refer to it. And the main distinction between these is observed in the leaves. So the white oak leaves on the left are pretty representative of the white oak family, where they have these rounded lobes on the leaves, whereas the red oaks on the right here have those pointy tips. And Elizabeth showed you that on a couple other species, and we'll look at that again today. But
before you
oh, go ahead.
you leave this, Ryan, you know, there's something else that's sort of interesting about the difference between the red oaks and the white oaks. Although it is true that the genus is genii, I don't know what the plural of genus is, fall into the red and the white, and that there are very distinct differences between them. They're actually named after the kind of wood, because the white oaks have a white wood, and that white wood grew quite slowly and is very tight, and people use it for whiskey barrels. Whereas the red oak, it's beautiful. It makes lovely flooring or tables because it's got so much color in it, but it's much looser wood, and you can't use that to carry whiskey.
Okay, and now we'll move along to our next tree here, which we didn't go far to get to. Right next, you can see the tree 27, the pin oak we just looked at, is right there in the map, and we've got tree 26 circled, which is a big, mature red maple. And you can see for scale there, Rowan standing next to it, and there's a tree tag in the middle of the trunk. Might be a little hard to see, but red maple, if we looked up into the limbs, like the view on the left there, we'd see opposite branching. So right away, that would narrow it down for us. We get into the, you know, the mad buck category, and that, again, that M at the start of mad is for maple. You can see those buds are starting to break or starting to form flowers on this large mature tree. But at other places in the park, there was younger trees that were just about in full flowering display the day we were there. So that's very beautiful. That's one of the main reasons we plant this tree a lot in cities and parks and places, is for its ornamental value when it flowers here. So this slide shows a little more close-up view of, you know, some flowering there. You see the wonderful little flowers with their pollen structures sticking out into the wind there, and that is indicative of a wind-pollinated tree. So most of our native trees in Illinois are pollinated by the wind. So the wind blows across those pollen-producing structures and sends that pollen out to land on another tree's flower somewhere, or maybe even within the same canopy there.
But even that isn't specific, in that the bees actually love this, and there's not that much blooming at that time. And so, Ryan, I'm wondering, when you took these pictures, did you see any bees or flies enjoying the flowers?
Yes, we did. And I, unfortunately, my camera skills are not good enough to get a great picture of those. But yeah, some of these lower limbs of red maples, the day we were there, it was probably, I mean, it was really warm. It was one of those really nice warm days several weeks ago. And there was a lot of insect life on these trees. And you're very, very right on that this is one of those very first sources of pollen to come out. And it's really important to a lot of our native insects. So I don't want to definitely discount their role in some of this, but the reason why it matters to me as a forester, whether it's a wind pollinated or an insect pollinated tree, is because even we humans can see a visual difference in those. So on a wind pollinated tree like this red maple, there's a lot of little tiny flowers all over the place. And those flowers, that tree, its focus is producing pollen in those flowers, where on an insect pollinated tree, we'd see fewer flowers that are larger and more showy, that draw in the insects visually. And those flowers, those trees, focus a little more energy on nectar production to draw in the insects, and a little less on pollen. So an insect pollinated tree is big showy flowers with a lot more nectar, whereas a wind pollinated tree is much smaller flowers and very little nectar, if any, and a lot of pollen produced. So that's a pretty good difference. And I would say the majority of our trees in Illinois are wind pollinated, the majority of our native trees. You know, one of the exceptions I can think of is a tree we've already talked about, catalpa, is insect pollinated. It has a really beautiful flower. And maybe tulip poplar is another example, but there's not a whole lot that are actually insect pollinated in Illinois in the true sense that I'm talking about botanically. So looking
And
at this,
here you can see the Samara as well on the right. And those are the fruits that have developed. And they also will depend on the wind, Ryan, because they will go down like little helicopters. And they'll probably be about a month after the flowers.
yeah, I think we've all played with the maple helicopters. That's one of Rowan's favorites, I know. Well, one last thing before we pop to the next slide is just a little bit on the leaf characteristics. And we'll look at a comparison of all the maples we talk about today in a later slide. But the main thing that tells me it's red maple is that curved bottom to the leaf. You see how the bottom just kind of has a nice curved bottom. As we look at the other maples, there's kind of a spiky little lobe that sticks out down there. So it makes the bottom margin of that leaf is characteristic for me. Okay, so let's head to our next tree, which is just around the corner. We haven't made it too far again, but tree number 23, another good sized mature tree. And here's Rowan standing next to this shingle oak to give us a little bit of detail.
Yes, you can see now shingle oak is the single most like the pin oak in the way that it grows. Remember we talked about those branches that hang down? If you look at the red bordered picture, you can see in that tree, the branches are hanging down. Whereas if you look at the tree that Rowan is standing under, they've probably cut those off because park people like to manage the trees better, so they cut things off like that. But the shingle oak actually also suffers from Marcescens in that it keeps those leaves all during the winter. And they have that bristle on the end that you saw when I showed you a shingle leaf when we were looking at simple leaf style. And I think I've got one in the next slide as well. There it is. And you can see in the winter, it's easy to find them hanging on the tree still, protecting those buds. And again, I'd like you to notice the shape of these acorns. They don't look anything like the white acorn. They come out straight, almost as though they're a dome rather than an oval. And that's quite indicative. And then looking over to the far side, you see the bark. And the bark, actually, it doesn't have as good ski trails as the red or the pin, but you can still see that somewhat.
Yeah, great bark pattern to differentiate between the white and red oaks too. So you usually can see a little trace of that ski pattern, and later towards the end we'll see northern red oak that really shows that well. So I think folks will be able to really see that clearly on the northern red oak. But that's another way that I kind of in my mind lump the two different oak families. But a little bit more about shingle oak though before we move on.
Oh yes, the shingle oak in this area suffers from the horned oak gall, which is that funny blocky thing you see there. The horned wasp lays its eggs on the twig, and then the twig responds by making this gall. And at first they thought that the galls on the shingle oak didn't do it any harm. But actually you can see, just looking at the picture on the left, that there are multiple galls on this one poor tree. And what happens is that any kind of twig growth past the gall dies. So you get no leaves, you get no tree growth, you get no energy from the sun, you make no sugar, and pretty much if there are enough of those, the tree dies. Here in Illinois, we have a significant problem with the shingle oaks, but the pin oaks and the red oaks also tend to suffer from this as well, but not quite as much as the shingle oaks. You can always use that as a characteristic here, almost.
Yeah, I've definitely heard this described as an identification feature on shingle oaks particularly, and I would totally agree. It's if you have a shingle oak, you have these galls somewhere in the canopy. It's just a matter of how many, and sometimes it can be a lot, sometimes it's just a few, but great point. Well, so now we moved on to tree number 20, and when Rowan and I got to this point, as you can see, he really had to study the map. He couldn't find that trunk with the tag, and couldn't find the tree, and so unfortunately, this tree was removed, which is just kind of a warning that if you do find a guide like this in a park close to you, there may be a tree missing. And I think the last publication of this guide was maybe as recently as 2016 or something. So in just that short time, this sugar maple that should have been there has disappeared. But we did want to cover sugar maple because it's definitely a very popular native tree and is well known by a lot of folks for the fact that we harvest that sap to make maple syrup. And that's what you see with those little buckets on the trunk there. They're harvesting sap in the springtime. And so that happens in the late winter, the very, very early spring. We have a sap run. It's definitely done this time of year in Illinois, but late February, early March, that's the main time that this sap is running, but starts as early as January. You can see the samaras. So this is in the, a maple, so in the Acer genus. And so it produces these little samaras. You can see the flower in the upper left. What a beautiful flower structure when it's pictured up close. Now far away, it would look small. And in the middle there, you can see a couple different pictures of the leaf. So the very green leaf in the middle of summer there, different from the red oak leaf or the red maple leaf because there's a little lobe there on the bottom. The bottom margin of this leaf doesn't have that nice even curve around there. There's a lobe kind of breaking it up. At the right there, you see the beautiful fall color that this tree has, and it's just one of the most beautiful in fall time all around its native range. And then the final two pictures of trunks there are meant to show you that there's a difference between that very young, smooth bark on the left and that rough, shaggy bark on the big mature tree on the right. So it can be a little tricky at different stages of its growth. And that's the case with probably some other trees too. There's other trees like hackberry and sycamore, or a few I can think of, that definitely have a different looking, very mature bark than they do in younger points of their life.
Well, that's very true. But also there are some places that you can go and expect the sugar maple. And so if you go to an old graveyard, at this time of the year, you'll know that you've found a row of sugar maples because they'll all be blooming with those little yellow hangy things. And so they're very easy to identify. And the old gnarled bark that you see in this picture is really indicative of a beautiful old sugar maple tree.
Okay, and now we continue down our path to the next tree, tree number 17. So this one we did find. Rowan was pretty quick to find the tag on this tree, and there you can see him standing next to it.
Yes. And so this is not one of my favorite trees, even though where you see that car parked, that's one of the places that I quite often will park and sit and have my lunch because it's not far from work. But the Norway maple is actually an invasive maple. It comes from Eastern Europe, and it's invaded the rest of Europe, and it came across and it invaded us. If you look at the twigs, do you see opposite? Or, oh, there you go. If you look at the twigs, do you see opposite or alternate? You immediately see in this example that it's opposite. And so then, it's mad Buckeye. And so maple is the M of mad. And yes, it's a maple. And if you look at the trunk, it's got those ski trails that I was telling you were in red and pin oak. But actually, the shape of the tree is very, very different from oaks. It's a little sturdy, and then it shoots out all of those big branches, whereas the red and pin oak go straight up for a long way. Another thing that's very indicative of the maple is look down at Rowan's feet, and you'll see that there are lots of superficial roots. And because of that, the maple is a very difficult tree to put next to the driveway or next to the boulevard, because it will have a tendency to disrupt the driveway or pavement stones. Oh, and here, how dare this invading plant have such wonderful flowers. At this time of year, you can drive through town and see bright yellow bunches of flowers. See how they're tight bunches, a little bit like the red maple was, not like the sugar maple, which was hanging down. And they're absolutely gorgeous. But looking at the leaf, you probably say, uh-oh, isn't that a sugar maple leaf? The best I can tell you is that the sugar maple is longer than it is wide, and the Norway maple is wider than it is long.
And we tried to show that on this slide. There's a picture of the two. And so at the top there, you can see the Norway maple that, just like Elizabeth said, is wider than it is long, and the sugar maple at the bottom is longer than it is wide. And it's not a real perfect distinction, but you can definitely see that in Norway maple, they're just fatter, wider leaves, I guess is one way. Another thing that I have noticed or know is a great thing you can look for is milky white sap at the base of that petiole or the stem of the leaf. If you pull this leaf off, sometimes you have to wait a minute for that sap to come, but that's a characteristic of Norway maple.
Absolutely. And they've used the Norway maple quite a bit in hybrids and crosses. For instance, you know that dark red, almost black tree that stays that color all the way through summer? It's called the Crimson King. That actually is a cross with Norway maple, and it doesn't have any good fall color. It just has that dark red in the summer, and I think you're far better off with the sugar maple.
I agree. I love that fall color. But yeah, if you do see like a purple leaf mature, like large sized maple tree, that's usually that Crimson King or another cultivar that's has those purple leaves. So kind of an interesting thing, but you know, another, again, a non-native kind of invasive tree. So I need to be careful where we plant that one. So now we moved on to tree number 16 there, which is a little smaller of a tree, not quite as mature as some of the others we've looked at. Here is Rowan standing next to it. And that, when he found the tag, we learned that it was white oak, so Quercus alba. And that's significant. And I know Elizabeth loves to mention this too, that this is our state tree in Illinois. And so a lot of us have probably heard of the state bird, the cardinal, or the state flower, the violet, but we do have a state tree. We even have a state soil. So there's lots of state symbols. This is our state tree, and definitely one of my favorites among our oak species. Here we have a couple different pictures of bark. So in the wintertime, that's something we're gonna be able to readily use as an identification feature. And one of the things I always see on white oak when it's large and mature are those patches where in the big trunk in the center here, you see kind of a lighter colored patch and then a darker colored patch. And if we could look all the way up that tree trunk, we'd probably see some of those different patches. So that's just places where some of the bark plates have fallen off a little faster than others and creates that kind of neat pattern. To the right, you see a younger stem that has different looking bark. So it has kind of these, the plates kind of bend up and there's some cracks in there that you can kind of see under. And so the bark definitely looks a little bit different. Acorns, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, these white oak acorns are a lot different than the red oak, most of the red oak family. They're, kind of oblong in shape. They've got a little bit more of a cap covering the nut, and they just aren't quite as stout and short and round as you would think of in the red oaks. We showed a picture of the bud here because all of these oak trees, red oak or white oak, have a nice cluster of terminal buds. So that's a good identification feature to get you into the oak, the Quercus genus, as you're trying to identify things. If you see that big cluster of terminal buds, good bet that it's an oak tree. And lastly, the leaf we see there has those rounded lobes. So that would have, if it was summertime and we could see leaves, that would have definitely tipped us off that it was the white oak. And so that brings us just around the corner to our next tree. We didn't have to go too far to find that. And a tree of similar size, as you can see with Rowan standing next to it there.
Oh, this is the swamp white oak. And it's not unlike the white oak, first of all, when you look, but if you happen to find a cap, you will notice that it has a very, very long stalk on it, much different from the white oak, although the acorn is about the same shape as the white oak. And the bark is not unlike the white oak. So how are you going to tell the difference? Very easily with the leaf. The leaf is white on the underside, and the way that it's white is because it's got long white hairs on it. And so in this picture, you can see that the leaf doesn't have as many of the deep lobes as the regular white oak, but it's got some lobes. Without lobes, I find it's quite easy to confuse this with a couple of other oak trees, the chestnut oak or the chinkapin oak. But it does actually have a few lobes, whereas the chestnut and chinkapin just have a wavy edge. The chestnut is a smooth wave, and the chinkapin, well, the way I remember it, the chinkapin has chinks taken out of it. And so it looks much more cut into at the sides.
Yeah, I just love that description of having the chinks out of it. I don't, ever since I've heard you say that, I don't think I'll ever forget that about a chinkapin. And those are just wonderful little tricks for trying to remember all this stuff. It's just having.
Absolutely. It really helps.
Yeah.
And Ryan, what you taught me is that the swamp white oak, actually, you can see that it has pieces of bark coming off away, exfoliating from the twigs. And I had never noticed that. And so that's another thing that tells us that it's swamp white oak, because the white oak won't have any of that exfoliation until you get back, or probably to 3 or even 4 years back towards the trunk. And
Yeah,
here you have the catkins hanging from the oak, which are again wind pollination, hanging out there, sending the pollen off to the next tree.
And so that brings us to our next tree. So we went just kind of wound around the corner here to another kind of medium-sized oak tree. You can see Rowan standing next to it there. And this is Bur Oak, or Quercus Macrocarpa. And so there's some pretty good distinguishing features on Bur Oak as well. The biggest one for me is that acorn in the upper right there. If you can find an acorn, and Rowan and I looked around this one and could not find a single acorn. But if you can find an acorn, it has that fringed cap. See those hairy fringes sticking off the cap, and a large nut. So that's probably significantly larger than our white oak acorn we looked at in the last slide. Another winter identification feature is pictured in the bottom slide there, where you can see it has corky twigs. So that's the twigs on the branch tips there, and those have a corky bark that kind of sticks off and is almost, if you're familiar with some other species that would have what we consider winged twigs, it's almost like a winged twig where it has little ridges of bark that stick off. Pretty characteristic.
And as long as it's not a young tree like this one, something else that you can see with the Bur Oak, which fascinates me, is that some of the branches are so long, they almost look like the tree is going to topple over and not be able to hold the branch.
Oh yeah, that is a really good one. I've seen a lot of Bur Oaks like that, especially like the open grown Bur Oaks on a field edge. I've got some of those in our pasture on our property that, yeah, I would say that lowest limb on our Bur Oak is almost as long as the tree is tall. That's a really good one. Well, lastly on this slide, if you had foliage or leaves that you could look at, the leaf is pretty characteristic because it has that big, large sinus right there in the middle. See that really large sinus that goes really close to the middle vein of the leaf, and that's pretty characteristic of Bur Oak if you have the leaves to look at. Now, the thing with oaks, though, that makes it especially tricky, we put together this kind of comparison slide to look at just the characteristic white oak, Bur Oak, and swamp white oak leaves. But what happens is within that canopy of a white oak or a Bur Oak or a swamp white oak, the leaves have different characteristics. Like leaves that are under shade can be much larger than leaves that are in the sun, and that's just an adaptation for that leaf to try and capture more sunlight. So within the canopy of any of these species, you can find leaves that have, you know, a kind of a mixture of some of these different characteristics. But to just look at what is the most distinctive leaf characteristics you can look at, you know, starting with white oak, it has these more symmetrical, deeper sinuses or lobes, whereas Bur Oak has that central, you know, really deep sinus there. Swamp white oak, to me, the best thing is what Elizabeth mentioned, is flipping that leaf over and looking for that really white underside. That's pretty characteristic for me, and it stands out pretty well, even in the field. A lot of times it's kind of hard to see from far away, but if you can get up close and flip that leaf over and hold it next to the top side of the leaf, that's another one. And Elizabeth, I think you have a few other things that you look at here.
Well, I'd like to come back to the fact that you said that you might see a leaf that's larger or smaller. And I want to remind people, if they ever see just a seedling, you know, maybe it's only a foot tall and maybe it's only got 3 or 4 leaves, but it's got to get its sunlight way, way down almost to the ground. And so it might have a leaf, an oak leaf that is a foot long and 6 inches wide, compared to these that might be only 2 or 3 inches. I think that you can't say anything specific about the size of the leaf. It's going to vary enormously. But
Yes.
what you can do is you can say the shape of the leaf, the shape of the sinuses. The small sinuses on the end of the burr are so different from that big sinus in the middle. The small sinuses all around the swamp white are so different from the jagged edge of the chestnut or the chinkapin.
Okay, and on our next slide here, we kind of compare the acorns of the three. And a lot of the pictures in this slide I took from the reference at the bottom of the slide there, the common oaks of the Chicago region. That's a little guide put out by the Field Museum and a free PDF online. Just a wonderful document that kind of compares a lot of our native oaks and contrasts. So they have a section of that where they show all of the acorns kind of at the same scale. So that's why I wanted to add this slide with each acorn. So these are taken out of that publication and they show, you know, the relative size of compared to each other. So, you know, you can see in the middle that Bur Oak acorn is pretty large and it has a fringe cap, but it doesn't cover the whole nut. Where in there's another native oak, the overcup oak, that we're not going to focus on today, but it would have a cap that just almost covers the entire nut. So that's a big distinction. And then again, we've kind of looked at it already. Elizabeth has some wonderful photography there of that super long stalk on the swamp white oak. So that's probably the biggest difference between those two acorns, but you can see they're pretty similar in that, you know, characteristic white oak kind of oblong acorn shape with a little bit larger of a cap than red oaks. And so this next slide is meant to kind of show us some of those bark characteristics. So again, Bur Oak would have those very corky twigs, you know, corky chunks sticking off the twig of the bark that's rapidly forming on those branch tips. Whereas swamp white oak, a little further back the limb, you see that bark is peeling up. So that's both those pictures on the right there of the same limb, and you can see this area that has that bark that's peeling off is a little further back the stem. Whereas on white oak, it would be even further back the stem. As Elizabeth mentioned earlier, it'd be on the, you know, maybe 3rd to almost 5th year's growth. And that for me as a forester out in the field in the wintertime in a stand of oak trees trying to differentiate some of these species, that was something I could see from the ground. I could see with or without leaves. It's one of those things that over the years has really worked well for me to kind of differentiate these 3 species.
And time is moving on, Ryan. I think we better get to the next tree.
Yeah, sounds good. So we're going to motor around the park a little bit. So our last tree was way back there at 13. We're all the way back around to 6. So big, large tree. You can see pictured there in the circle. And here's Rowan at the base. Elizabeth, do you want to start us off on red oak?
Oh, sure. This is the northern red oak. He's a wonderful tree, and he stands really tall and straight, very similarly to the way that we saw the pin oak at the beginning. And he has much larger acorns than the pin oak. And so we asked Rowan to see if he could find any of the acorns at the bottom of the tree. And he couldn't, but he found a couple of cups. And you notice that these cups are very, very flat. They remind me of the Scotsman's tam o' shanter, the little flat hat that the Scotsman wears. And you also notice that the shape of the acorn is not oval like the white oak. It's more sort of squat. And then we see the red oak leaf, and you've already learned by now there are bristles on all of the red oak family, and here you can see the bristles very, very clearly on the red oak. And looking back to where Ryan is, you might think that it's a little difficult, but if you look carefully, you can see those ski trails on the trunk. And if you can't see them very well down at the bottom there, they usually show up really, really well if you look up higher. And here's an example of that. Looking up to the upper reaches of the northern red oak, and you see those ski trails really, really clearly.
And so now we've continued almost all the way around in an entire lap to tree number 3, which will be, I think, the last tree we'll cover today. And so it's a little bit off the path there. You can see you've got to kind of mosey over to it, but here's a picture of Rowan standing next to it. It's a large, mature silver maple. So we would have, Rowan and I walked up to that, and we could pretty clearly see, you see pictured there, some nice opposite branching that told us it was one of the mad buck trees. And M in the mad is for maple, so this was one of the maples. We looked. I was able to tell kind of from bark. I feel like the bark on a mature silver maple really exfoliates, so really has some plates that are sticking off. That picture kind of shows it well on the right side of the trunk there. You can kind of see some bark plates that are sticking off. Another feature that kind of helps with silver maple identification, if you can find them, are the fruits or the samaras up there in the upper right. They're a little larger than both the other maples, so that's a great identification feature. And then, the bottom right there, we have a nice picture of the flowers. And Elizabeth, did you have anything else to add on silver?
Well, yes, as much as I love the silver maple, and it's a big, sturdy, wonderful tree, it's sort of naughty. You don't really want it around your buildings because it throws twigs all the time. I don't know what it is about this tree that does it, and the other maples don't, but it throws twigs onto the ground all the time. And it does suffer also from those superficial roots that I talked about with the Norway maple. And those roots can disrupt the paving. And so I suggest that if you want to grow a maple, the sugar maple or the red maple, which is supposedly a smaller tree, although the one that we happened to see was very large. So the red maple or the sugar maple would make a lovely tree to choose for your yard.
And so,
no, you carry on, Ryan.
Okay, here's kind of just a comparison of the buds, and the main point we just wanted to show you is, again, a great view of opposite branching. You can see those twigs coming out right opposite of each other, but that sugar maple bud is really pointy compared to both red maple and silver maple. So it pays to pay attention to those buds and take a look for that pointy bud. That can help even narrow down amongst our opposite branching trees. And then this slide kind of compares all the leaves. And so at the left, you see our red maple that kind of has that rounded base that doesn't have tooth down there or lobe down there. Where on our sugar maple, we see a lobe at the bottom. On silver maple, you see lobes or jagged teeth all around. And one major distinguishing feature between the three of these is that sugar maple, if you look at the tip and the pointy lobe at the tip, it has an entire margin, meaning there's no teeth along it. where on the red maple, you can see some kind of smaller, more jagged teeth. Again, on the silver maple, very jagged, larger teeth identify it, as well as I have this leaf flipped over in this picture. You can see the back of it is silvery, kind of like the white back of the swamp white oak. But that's kind of how this tree was named, is from the silver back. Now, the only thing that's wrong with my picture here is probably silver maple leaves are a little larger. I should have got a better representation of silver maple, but this just happened to be the 3 maples I could find in the arboretum I was at to take this shot. But one other difference is in their fall color, and you can see that you know, red maple has a very pretty fall color. Sugar maple has an amazing fall color that you know, really has everything from yellow to orange to red. And then our poor old silver maple just doesn't have much of a fall display. It's kind of just a yellow or almost brownish color in fall. So it definitely doesn't have those ornamental characteristics we like in sugar.
And it looks sort of tattered, you know, because it has all those long pieces hanging off it. So,
oh yeah,
again,
very much.
I suggest the sugar maple or the red maple, 2 gorgeous trees.
I agree. And so that brings us to the end of our tree walk today. We'll open things up for questions in a minute. Here's my contact information, and you guys are welcome to forward any questions about tree ID or tree care or any of those kind of things to me. I answer those on a regular basis. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and we'll unmute the audience and take a few questions if you guys have a few questions. Okay, I think everybody should be unmuted now. So feel free to.
No questions?
You guys can speak up, or you can type in the chat box as well if you can see how to enter text into the chat box.
Ryan, let's put you and me up there again.
Oh yeah, sure. Let's see. All right, you guys should see me again.
Do red maples, are red maples the only tree where the leaves have a red stem?
Oh, that's a good question. Did you hear that, Elizabeth?
I think that's true. I was wondering about the Norway maple. Do you know, Ryan?
Norway's not so much, and actually, you know, where I'm sitting at on our second story, I can see a Norway maple right out my window. So it's not as red as Norway maple. It's more of it's an orangey color, but I definitely would not call it red. Silver maple, it kind of depends on the individual trees. Sometimes silver maple are quite a bit more red than other silver maples, and sometimes, to even complicate this more and confuse everybody even more, sometimes these trees hybridize. So there's hybridization that can happen.
Oh, that's true.
So there you go. It's biology. There's genetic variation. There's variability with hybridization. So you know, I do hear that a lot. And yeah, it's safe to say that for the straight, you know, genetics that make, you know, red maple, it should have more red twigs than anything else. But again, you know, silver maple can kind of have that as well. I don't see as much on sugar maple.
I wanted to tell you all that we're going to do a part 2, and we're still developing it at the moment. Pardon?
I think that's a little bit of feedback. I'm going to mute everybody, but you guys have the ability to unmute yourselves if you want to talk, or there's also a way you could raise your hand. So anyway, go ahead, Elizabeth. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, so I was going to say, we would love to hear your critical feedback so that we could do better next time. We've had enormous fun doing this. We love this park, but we love trees in general. And the next one is going to focus more on what do we mean by a native tree and what makes something native and why should we even care anyhow?
Yep, that'll be fun. And so that's actually the advertising for that should go out today. That's going to be on April 30th. So that's a Thursday evening. I think we said 5:30.
Yes.
5:30. but an evening program, so please tune in if you want to. And, you know, even all the way from out east, a lot of our trees are the same. So hopefully we can cover some trees that you guys all would be interested in as well. So again, you guys see my contact info up there. Feel free to email me or contact me if you have questions or want to find our registration info for the next one. But does anybody else have a question before we kind of wrap things up for today?
You said April 30th at 5:30. Are you referencing Central Time or Eastern?
Oh, that's Central Time.
Yeah.
Great
Okay,
point.
thank you.
Yeah, so that'd be let's see, you guys would be 6 o'clock.
6:30.
6:30.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, please join us again. We'd love to have you.
Yeah, from Baltimore.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay, I
Okay,
think that's
well.
about it.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for being our audience today. This was a great chance to re-record and connect with you folks from all the way across the country.
Nice job. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye, guys.
Okay, Cal, I'm off, love.
thank you.
I know, I didn't mean to disturb you. I'll have to figure out how to do it for the next.
Here, hang tight, Elizabeth. I'll talk to you for a minute once the meeting